I want to thank you all again for coming. I'd like to thank our co-hosts at GW Success Talks for obviously this good and for helping us out with everything. I'd also like to thank the Indusforum and Mr. Mumford from the Washington Group for making this all possible. And our greatest thanks are obviously reserved for Professor Guptara. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So my thanks to Parth for that very generous, over-generous introduction. And it's thanks also through him and others who may be here who are members of the Indian Students Association for kindly hosting this meeting, along with the group called Success Talks. That's it. I was trying to remember what the group is called from the business school. Great. And Alex, and you're in it as well? You're not. Who else is there from the? Two of you. Yeah? Yeah. Great. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here as part of a 6-city tour of the US, which Indusforum put together and invited me to be part of. And the 6 cities that are involved are Houston, Chicago, Atlanta, Philadelphia, New York, and now DC. So this is the last of the 6-city, last city in the 6-city tour. And so if I appear to be a little not quite with it, you'll know what the reason is, apart from the heat, of course. So, and thanks to Sunish, whose vision it was to put together Indusforum. And as a result of that, what all are we doing in DC? Just remind me. Okay.
Network of South Asian professionals and Harvard Business School Club of District of Columbia. 3 ambassadors or deputy chiefs of mission, and a number of other meetings.
So that's all in the next 2 days. So, and then I head back home. So I'll be very happy to be back home. And thanks to John Mumford, who's kindly hosting Sunish and myself while we're here for these 3 or 4 days. So thank you very much, John, and also for organizing the whole thing, of course, in coordination with these good folk. So I guess my talk falls into 3 neat parts. The first is intensifying global competition. The second is, of course, is India ready? And the third is, are Indians ready? Now, some bits will interest you more than other bits out of those 3, but I'll try to be kind of even-handed in my discussion of those 3. And please feel free to interrupt, because we're a small group, and the great advantage of small groups is it can be a conversation. I was brought up on the tradition that the best number of students is 2, and I had to produce essays every week for my tutor, who came without any preparation, and my job and the job of the other tutee was to read our essays, and his job was to slaughter our essays. That was our education. That's a very good way to be educated. Anyway, so intensifying global competition. Of course, competition is natural in any society. It's not just in capitalist societies that competition is natural. You can see competition all around us in the non-human world. So, you know, there's nothing special or new about competition. But the question I'm raising is whether we have intensifying global competition. And if we have intensifying global competition, in what areas does that competition express itself? And I guess by implication, I'm asking the question, how much greater competition can we get? And what are the consequences if the competition gets too high? But I'm not going to address the last 2 questions here. You can raise it if you want for discussion at whatever point. Now let me start by saying that next month in India's premier liberal arts college, St. Stephen's College in Delhi, 400 undergraduate students will be admitted. Every year they admit 400. When I went there were 200. And now there are 400. Nothing has changed in the facilities, they're exactly the same. No, I lie, 1 new building has come up, but they now admit 400 students. Well, for these 400 students, there were 12, for these 400 places, there were 12,000 candidates competing in 2007. So that was 4 years ago. 12,000 is a lot of people competing for 400 seats. But by 4 years later, by 2011, last year, the number of people competing for these 400 seats had gone up, not from 12,000 to 13,000 or 14,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 or 25,000. It had gone up to 26,000 in 4 years. Nearly, what would you say? Nearly unbelievable, isn't it? I think it's gone up from 12,000 to 26,000. Of course, demographics is part of it, but it's also that more people are being educated from that population, and as a result, obviously, competition goes up. This year, there are going to be, if the law of averages holds, then 30,000 applicants for those 400 seats. So, of course, that's one way in which competition goes up. Let's call it a competition for resources, because education is, in some senses, a resource. And if you get it, then, of course, you can do things with it. So we don't normally think of education as a resource. But for the moment, I'm going to treat it as a resource because it's a very, for me, a convenient bridge into talking about the competition for resources as a whole. Now, you know and I know that the Chinese are doing what with the 2.3 trillion that they have, 2.4 trillion that they have, which they had in 2009, now of course maybe a bit more. They are going around buying up everything they can, aren't they? They're buying up agricultural fields because they don't have enough agricultural land in China. They're going up buying up oil and gas fields, aren't they? They're buying minerals, mineral areas, oil fields. They're buying up rare earth sort of properties. They're getting old, you name it, they're going out and buying it, aren't they? So, and they're not the only people trying to buy these things. You know, India is in competition with China, Europe is in competition with China, America is in competition with China for all these resources. And that's, of course, one reason why resource commodity prices have been going up, because there's a huge amount of competition for them, right? Another reason is speculation, but we can come to that later, if you like. So that's one kind of competition for resources, and that's sort of easy to understand. But I want to suggest to you that there's a second kind of competition. This is a competition for workers. You're a company, you're in competition with other companies for workers. United States is in competition with Europe, Australia, Canada for immigrants. Why does it want immigrants? Because these are workers, isn't it? Now, you may think that in the United States it's a bit strange to talk about competition for workers when there's so many unemployed people. But the fact is that human population seems to have been split into two categories. Those who are unemployable, because they aren't clever enough, they aren't hardworking enough, they aren't motivated enough, they aren't educated enough, they aren't skilled, whatever, right? They're unemployable, and those who are employable and therefore competing for jobs. And of course, you know that chief executive salaries have zoomed up. Why have the chief executive salaries zoomed up? I mean, if there's a lot of supply, then probably chief executive salaries shouldn't go up that much, should they? Because price is a function of what? Demand and supply, right? So you can consider a chief executive's salary a price, can't you? It's a function of supply and demand. So why is there, you'd think there'd be a lot of competition for chief executive jobs, wouldn't you? And there is. But the problem is, it's not enough. Why is it not enough? Because to be a chief executive, you need to have certain skills, certain education, certain experience, and very importantly, the willingness to take on extraordinarily demanding responsibilities. I mean, I don't know if you've looked at the legal responsibilities of a chief executive or chairman. They're horrendous. So it's not surprising that the salary goes up. But that's only one example. At a more ordinary level, salaries for IT workers in India have been going up at 17% per year ever since liberalization started till the last quarter of last year. And the reason it slowed down last quarter of last year was obviously, the crisis started hitting India. The crisis started in 2007, hits us only in 2011, but it hits us nevertheless. And I'm sure the figures are even worse for China than for India. So there's competition for resources, right? There's competition for workers, and there's also competition for customers. Why is there competition for customers? Because for the first time in history, we are living in a world of overproduction. There was a time at the end of the 19th century when we had something like that, but that was not overproduction in terms of the world as a whole. It was in terms of the world that trade could reach, and the places that trade could reach at the end of the 19th century were a lot, because that was the first wave of modern globalization, but nowhere near as extensive as we have today. So today we have genuine overproduction for the whole of the world. Because what's happened? Technology has made it possible for us to produce everything very fast, very efficiently, good quality, low price, and all the rest of it, isn't it? And it wasn't that long ago, it was only at the end of the Second World War, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, that people were starving. Isn't it? My parents' generation, probably your parents' grandparents' generation, faced starvation. There were ration cards, and you had to go and stand in line for sugar and wheat and bread and butter, and you didn't see an orange. In Europe, you never saw oranges for years. It's only the 60s that oranges started coming into the UK. Bananas, you never saw bananas because bananas were so exotic a commodity in England. So in just a couple of generations, we've gone from that kind of shortage to oversupply. We have essentially oversupply in all fields. We have too many banks. I used to work for a bank till last year. We have too many banks in the world. We have, come in. We have overproduction of potato chips, and we have overproduction of computer chips. Doesn't matter what you're talking about. We have too much beer being produced. We have too much wine being produced. We have too many cars being produced. You can just go on and on and on. And the result of that is fierce competition, horrendous competition. Now, what is the most dramatic example of competition for customers that we have seen in the last 10, 20 years? I suggest to you that it's the subprime mortgages. Because actually, mortgages are not subprime. Mortgages are mortgages, right? We call mortgages subprime mortgages when perfectly good mortgages get sold to people who should not have those mortgages, right? So it's the people who are subprime in terms of the income levels for that kind of mortgage. Not the mortgages are subprime. So how come people were selling mortgages to people who shouldn't have those mortgages? Well, the answer to that is fairly complex because it had to do with politics, it had to do with law. And laws made it possible for those things to happen. It had to do with the structure of the industry, financial industry, housing industry. It had to do with the structure of institutions in the government, Freddie and Fannie and all the rest of it. And I guess it had something to do with the performance incentives given to salespeople. And to their bosses, and to the heads of their divisions, and so on. So, the result was that it wasn't just one or two people who were sold mortgages they shouldn't have had. It was tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who were sold mortgages they shouldn't have. So the competition for customers is fierce, and it's so fierce that in a boardroom in Switzerland, where one of my friends was a member of the board, he told me afterwards there was a shouting match between two people on the board, which never happens. The Swiss are very calm, very, not like Americans, very calm, very reserved. Basically the voice doesn't rise. And they say, if they're going to say something very rude in a very quiet voice, I mean rude in the sense of abrupt and or might be offensive to you perhaps, they say in the language, in the local language, if I'm to speak like a German, this is what I would say. So it's quite interesting that in this boardroom there was a shouting match between two board directors. And it was about a difference of opinion about a certain plan that they had, a certain strategy they were going to follow. And one board director said to the other guy, "You don't understand that it's war out there." And what he was talking about was, of course, competition for customers. So we could go on to, look at the competition in many other ways if we wanted to, but I suggest those three dimensions are enough for the moment, and we can take that further in discussion if you like. I want to shift to India and to ask the question whether India is ready for a world of increasing global competition. Now, I don't know what you think, Digvijay.
Right. So when you talk about the workers, the work in a lot of work is coming out, and there are a lot of work being provided to them. So do you think how much is the executive person's salary? How much is the contribution from the working class and the people in the game? Do you think there's a major contribution to that?
Do you mean in India or do you mean anywhere?
Anywhere, like in Germany.
I would say that in Northern European and North America basically, the contribution from people lower down the food chain is quite significant, because there is an openness of atmosphere and workers are expected to say what they think, and bosses expect workers to say what they think. I mean, of course, treat them, politely, but disagreements are quite open, and there's not a problem in the US or in Northern Europe about it. Switzerland is a bit of a special case. Disagreements are there, but they're always sort of put in a very nice way. So they say in Switzerland that it's not what you say, it's how you say it that matters. So you can express your disagreements with the CEO, it's not a problem, but you have to watch how you put it. But in the US, I don't think anybody watches that. Well, you may watch it to a certain extent, but you don't need to, because the idea is everybody will put their ideas forward, the best ideas will win, and on the basis of the best ideas winning, the company as a whole will go forward. And if I'm the CEO and I've got something wrong, I want to be told that. Because at the end of the day, my paycheck is dependent not on my brilliant ideas, but on the performance of the economy, of my company. So if your idea is going to help the company go forward, I have no problem, because I'm the guy who's benefiting from it, right? I mean, you are too, of course, but CEO is going to benefit from it, so why not? This is not the case when you get down to Southern Europe. It's not the case when you get down to Latin America. It's certainly not the case when you get east of Turkey or south of Turkey. So when you get as far as Japan, then some very interesting things start happening. You know that in the Japanese language, you can change the entire meaning of a sentence by the last word you use. It's a very interesting language. So, you're talking, and as you're talking, you're looking into the person's eye and watching their body language to see what the reaction is, and then you can change the meaning of the sentence by the very last word you use. It's quite fascinating. And you certainly don't confront anybody. I was in Indonesia. The only time I was in Indonesia in my life, I was going through because of personal reasons, and I was staying with friends, and this particular friend said, "Oh, you must meet so-and-so. He's a fascinating guy. You get on very well with him, and he might," at that time I was running a consultancy, "he might be able to give you a huge contract in an area that he's working on and looking for a consultant about." So I said, "Fine. If you ring him up and set up the appointment, I'll turn up." So he said, "Fine." So he rings up this guy. I turn up for the appointment. I spent maybe 45 minutes with him. Everything was very pleasant. And then, I left at the end of my 45 minutes. When I got back to this friend's home who was hosting me, he said, "How did the interview go?" I said, "Well, as far as I could tell, it went very well." He said, No, but what happened?" I said, what do you mean, what happened? No, tell me from the beginning to the end exactly what happened. So he had me go through the whole of the interview, question by question, answer by answer. He said, "Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's fine." And then he says, "So what happened at the end?" So I said, "Well, he said, he'll keep in touch, and if something comes up, then he'll be, he'll let me know why you." He said, "But where was he when he said that?" What do you mean, where was he? So he says, "Was he sitting behind his desk?" I said, No, he was not sitting behind his desk. So where was he? He was standing up against the window. And where were his hands? That's a very peculiar question. Where were his hands? His hands were behind him. So he said it was a very polite way of saying, "No, thank you." But he wasn't going to articulate that. It was his body language that was telling me that. If I was Indonesian, I would have picked up the message straight away. And of course I didn't, because I was not Indonesian. But this guy knew. That's why he was going through it very carefully with me, the whole of it. So it's just to answer your question about, how upfront you can be. And one of the issues I think for China is going to be that if you can't bring bad news to your bosses and there's no free press, then how do you get intelligent people to make intelligent decisions? However intelligent you are, the quality of your decisions is dependent on the information that's fed to you. So anyway, India, to what extent is it ready? Well, my answer is going to be pretty depressing to those of you who know India. India is not ready at all. And the reason why India is not ready at all, in contrast to China, is because China growth, not just that China is growing at, was growing at 12%, now growing at 8%. India was then growing at 8, 9, 10, 11%, but behind China. Now it's growing at 6% roughly. The reason is not that there's a difference in growth rates. Obviously there is a difference in growth rates, but that's not the basic thing. Basic thing is that China grows because the country is run like a machine by the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. So what the Politburo and company decide, really happens. not all the way through, and they do have some free markets, but basically that's what happens. If you go to Freedom Square, you will find that 1 in every 3 over there is Secret Service agent. And the Chinese will tell you, that guy's Secret Service, that guy's Secret Service, very interesting. So that's what happens in China. In India, whatever growth we have happens in spite of the best efforts of the government to stop growth taking place. Because the people are entrepreneurial. People want to do business. And the people find their way around, dodge their way around all the blocks the government can create in order to produce wealth. And that's why, even though the country is only growing at roughly 6% at the moment, I don't anticipate that it will go down very much. Whereas in the case of China, I think China will start going down this year because, as I said, the Chinese can't bring bad news to their bosses. And all the problems that have been kind of cooking in the Chinese economy will, I think, surface this year. And I hope they solve it, but I don't know if they can. I don't know if they will. So India is not ready for global competition, primarily because of corruption. Corruption is India's #1 problem. Now, I was talking about this to somebody, I think, was it in Houston? I can't remember. And the person said, well, corruption is factored in. You know, we're growing. Corruption is not new. Corruption has been growing in India since 1960, whatever. And in spite of the growing competition, India is still growing at 6%. So what's the problem? It's already factored in. So I said there are 2 or 3 problems. The first problem is, if you're healthy, your system can probably tolerate more viruses without you getting sick than if your system is not very good. Problem number 1. Problem number 2. If you get sick, the consequences are much worse if you're not healthy versus if you're healthy. Problem number 3, when corruption goes beyond a certain point, then it starts distorting the growth of the country, because all the black money that you have is going to go into what? Not normal things. It's going to go into those things where you can either hide the money or it's going to go into conspicuous consumption. And therefore, the economy will find that economic resources are not being directed where they are going to be most productive, but they're rather directed to things that are useless, that is to say, conspicuous consumption, or into things where you can hide the money very easily, which will mean that there'll be a huge bubble in that area, and we know what bubbles do. Bubbles at some point burst, and when bubbles burst, then of course the consequences are quite horrid, or can be quite horrid. A very good illustration of this is the Bangalore Metro, which was opened on exactly when I was there for one of my visits, and I was reminded that the plans for the Bangalore Metro had been made in the year 1980. They were exactly the same plans that were finally being implemented one whole generation later. Why did it take 30-odd years for the Bangalore Metro to start being built? Because our politicians couldn't make up their minds who was going to get how much under the table. So corruption is a huge issue which really skews everything in the country, and I'm sure we're aware of some of the scandals and so on that happen in India. The second is transport and infrastructure. If you're going to have an economy growing quickly, you need to have working roads, you need to have working bridges, you need to have working ports, airports, and all the rest of it. We're sorting out a few things, but it's too slow, and of course it's taking a long time. Energy, large parts of the country don't have energy. We don't have a proper energy policy, and you'll find that even in the capital city, suddenly electricity can go off in the middle of the summer. Water may or may not be there at certain times of the day, and these are capital cities, you know, it's the capital city we're talking about. But the most fundamental problem in India, apart from corruption, I believe, is education. And the reason why salaries are going up at 17% was simply because India is not producing enough educated people for the demand that is there, specifically in the IT sector. But of course the demand is there all across. So we find that you can't get qualified teachers, and if you do get qualified teachers, they're not motivated to go to the areas where there's real need, whether it's slums or whether it's rural areas. So India government has introduced a Right to Education Act. Are you familiar with that? There's something called the Right to Education Act, but it's a very mixed kind of thing, and its implementation hasn't really produced very good results so far. The one sector where India is doing very well is, of course, IT. Sorry? Yeah. Sorry, which one? Yeah, business sector as a whole, but a lot of business sector in India is, Indian. When you talk about global competition, then that's what the context in which I was asking that. But you're right, it is business as a whole in India does very well, which is the reason why India grows. But globally speaking, of course, it's IT, which is where India's great competitive advantage is. And in that, there are some questions for the future, I think. IT will continue to grow, I believe. IT outsourcing will continue. But IT outsourcing may not continue to India if there are major political problems around the world. So, for example, if China collapses, for example, if there is some kind of conflict in the Middle East, Iran or whatever, then this will mean that, for example, in the United States, people will not be very happy to have their work shipped to India. People will say, we want Indians, but we don't want the work in India. So we'll just increase the number of visas, bring the workers here, and get the work done here, which obviously has other attractions for the US economy, because it means taxes get paid here, which means the consumption expenditure is done here, great stimulating effect for the economy. So I can imagine that if there's any problem anywhere in the world, the tendency of the United States will be to say, get these guys here, we don't want to ship work over there. What is the disadvantage of that? The disadvantage of that is the reverse side of which is that obviously the employment is not in India, and the expenditure is not in India, and the taxes are not in India. But that's not the main problem. I think the main problem is that most of the IT work that is outsourced to India consists in, I don't know what you call it, grunk work, stuff which is not very exciting.
I read an article recently saying how some of the IT firms in the they outsource Indian IT workers illegally, and they have some frauds like that going on for a long time, but they have just been undetected.
Yeah.
And they somehow try to manage to get them work permits going.
That is an issue, and I'm sure it'll be, such things as they come out will be a problem, but I don't think it's going to affect the overall situation. I think the main problem is that most of the work that's outsourced to India is actually just, basic donkey work, which needs to be done, gets done by Indians. It's basically kind of slave labor. It's not slave labor, but it's a kind of elementary work which needs to be done, which gets outsourced to India. And Indian IT companies are not putting in enough effort into coming up with new products, coming up with new services, coming up with new things that can be patentable, whether software or hardware. And as a result of that, the effect is going to be that all the intellectual capital in the IT industry will continue to be with Americans or Europeans, or indeed now Chinese, because the Chinese have really driven. I don't know how much you follow things in China, but the Chinese have got a very fascinating higher education policy under which anybody who wants to do higher education is basically paid to do higher education, is offered accommodation. You know how tough it is to get accommodation, is basically offered accommodation and food. So basically they don't, they're basically, sort of looked after to do their studies. And the result of that is there's a huge amount of research now coming out of China, and the number of patents that's coming out of China is absolutely zooming. So India likes to think that it outperforms on services, and China will outperform in manufacturing goods, and that this situation will carry on forever. But I think some of us who are very concerned about India's future think that India needs to change its research and development policy. Otherwise, China will start outstripping us even in IT. So I'll stop that depressing account at that point, and we can come back and discuss it further if you want, and come on to the more interesting question: are Indians ready for global competition? But I think the answer is quite clear when you look at Indians who come to the US, because you find that Indians who come to the US shine, isn't it? And I can give you facts and figures about how many people in the world of medicine, how many people in the world of engineering, how many people in the world of IT, how many people in the world of hospitality, how many people in the world of jewelry, and so on, are from the Indian background. And the fact is that Indians constitute the highest per capita income ethnic group in this country, even ahead of Caucasian whites. So they came here with very little, and they've made it to the highest income group. That should demonstrate that they're ready for global competition, because you've got as much competition inside the United States as you've got anywhere. So why do Indians do so well when they come to the US, and we don't do so well in India? Well, that may have something to do with the legal system. It may have something to do with the availability of money. It may have something to do with the openness to ideas, and so on and so forth. But I think it also has something to do with the fact that India itself is a highly competitive country, and has been a highly competitive country. For example, I mentioned the number of people competing for seats in a college. Yeah? You don't get that level of competition in many places. And I know of institutions in India where there are 1,000 people competing for every single seat in the area of technology and in the area of management. The particular example I quoted was liberal arts. So in the area of technology, medicine, accountancy, etc., the competition just zooms up. So we're used to competition. We start being trained for competition from a very young age, drilled for competition from the age of about 3. And I guess you could say that parental expectations are very high. Parental support is very high. And by parents, we don't mean just mother and father. In the Indian system, you mean grandparents, uncles, aunties, siblings, cousins. Everybody's involved in this race for doing better and better. So the whole system pushes you to perform high in competition. The other thing is that we hunt in packs. We are a highly socialized kind of group of people, like many others. But knowledge of English gives us a certain facility, Indians, and enables us to hunt in packs much more effectively in English than would be the case, for example, in the Middle East, or that would be the case in China, that would be the case in Latin America, and so on. So Indians are ready for global competition, I think. And when you look at Silicon Valley, you see Indians coming up with patents, you see Indians producing companies. About a third of Silicon Valley consists of Indians, right? And all of them seem to be doing very well. We have produced about 200,000 millionaires in this country. And they didn't come here very long ago. So Indians do very well, and I think Indians are fit for global competition, even though India is not. But in a world that is highly volatile and vulnerable, I think there is an interesting question to ask, and that is, what is going to be the future of jobs? In which areas are jobs going to come up? And I want to conclude by just offering you some thoughts on that, and then we can have interaction for as long as you want. In a world where the global structure of industry is changing very rapidly as a result of the impact of IT, one of the key things that is happening and will continue to happen is that global supply chains are being reconfigured and will continue to be reconfigured. So if you look at the structure of industry, it was that there was somebody manufacturing and middle men or middle companies mediating, and then the industry used to sell kind of to the customer. You can still see this in the structure of our high streets. Yeah, there's production in a particular industry, there are middle people mediating the sales, and then each of them is selling direct to the customer. We do have, of course, business-to-business sales, but each of them functions in the same way. But now what's happening as a result of IT is that you can get a lot produced by automated factories, and who owns the automated factories is not that important. Middle men and women and companies are being squeezed out. Why? Because the manufacturer can go directly to the market. And if you think of Amazon, or if you think of eBay, you have examples of sales channels through which all kinds of products can be sold to the customer without you having to go to a shoe shop or a shirt shop or a watch shop, which is the way that our high streets are, isn't it? Our high streets are organized along pharmacies and, you know, food shops and watch shops and whatever else, yeah, jewelry stores and whatever else. But this is not the way necessarily that you have to shop when you go on the internet. You can go to a single store, and through that single store, Amazon or eBay or whichever the store you like, you can buy everything. Theoretically, you could buy an airplane, you could buy a car, you could buy whatever you want from Amazon, theoretically, right? Now, the old supply chains consisted of the manufacturer supplying to the middleman or woman or company, and the middleman or woman or company selling to you as a customer. That's not the structure that we are in today. The structure that we are in today is that all kinds of manufacturers have to be coordinated by Amazon or eBay or its equivalent, whichever your favorite shopping center is, right? And they have to somehow all find their way into the kinds of lorries or trucks or whatever you call them, by which they can be distributed to everybody in the United States. So you've got now a single pipeline, if you want to call it that, through which all the products can be mediated to all the customers, and the whole thing is organized by information technology. So you see, the structure of industry has changed, and this has changed right across the world. So we're going through an enormous change in terms of logistics, and as far as I can see, this change will continue. So if you're looking for jobs, then logistics is not a bad area to look at. Logistics companies, logistics functions are not a bad area to look at in terms of jobs. Parts.
I guess it's like an interesting note, more of a comment. Even logistics, I think in the future might be wiped out. There's like new innovations like 3D printing and
Sure.
Additive manufacturing, where
Sure.
you can literally just send a file, and
Yep.
that's all it requires for you to print out.
Sure.
I think Boeing is printing out different types of bearings,
Yeah.
titanium bearings.
Yeah.
And they used to like waste 98% of
Mhm,
titanium
mhm,
they use.
mhm.
And now there's zero
Sure.
efficiency with
Sure.
these sort of 3D printers. So
Yeah.
it's amazing to think that.
Yeah, you're jumping one step ahead of me, but you're absolutely going in the right direction, because what will happen is that this single pipeline will be replaced by a virtual pipeline as you go into 3D printing and manufacturing on demand. The difficulty is that at present this applies only to high-value products, and it's as the products that can be produced go down in value and multiply in variety that you'll find that you'll be able to print these out at home, or produce them, manufacture them at home. Manufacture one piece rather than the kind of mass manufacturing we've had so far in the Industrial Revolution from the 18th century onwards. So yeah, we are going into that, but that's the next step, which is why I say that the changes that are going on now are going to accelerate and multiply. And so the whole logistics area is a very fascinating area to look at. But you're right, it won't last forever. It'll maybe have a 10 to 20 year lifespan, and then my guess is that it'll start drying up. So what other area is there to look at? Well, I mentioned earlier that we're in a world of intense competition, and in a world of intense competition, marketing is king. So if you can get into marketing firms or get into the marketing function within a firm, that's the kind of area that will grow. Sales is the kind of function that will grow. Marketing and sales are greater areas to get into, and that will not disappear in 10 years or 20 years, because those are areas that will not stop. The intense competition is not going to stop. Last point, last area that I think will continue to do well, and that is creativity. So whether it's creativity in terms of IT, goods, manufacturing, services, cultural products or whatever, you will find that anything in the area of creativity, because that's where innovation comes from, that's where new products come from, that's where new services come from. So creativity is a great area to focus on. So do your studies in international relations or whatever it is, but think, what am I going to do in terms of a job? What kind of a job am I going after? Let's say you want to be a diplomat. Not a bad ambition at all, is it? But if you want to be a diplomat, don't think in traditional terms. Think, how is the world of diplomacy going to be affected by changes in the world, specifically in terms of logistics, marketing, and creativity? And think that the world of diplomacy is going to be driven by it as much as the world of manufacturing or sales or local government or whatever. So I'll stop there and invite you to offer questions and comments and disagreements and whatever.